Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you once again to our second podcast. Just to recollect, the last podcast that we were talking about use of today with Mr. Webuzo Keho, which was quite an interesting topic and quite an interesting conversation ensued from there. Today also we'll be talking about another very familiar but no less interesting topic, and that is on obedience. And to talk on today's topic, we have in our studio at this very moment Miss Yameichon Rimai, whom we also call as Yaya. Hello, Yaya.
Hi, Mijing.
Thank you for joining us in today's podcast. Now, before we begin our conversation about obedience today, maybe, Yaya, you could tell us a little bit more about yourself so that our viewers and listeners would know more about you.
As Mijing has introduced me, my name is Yameichon Rimai, and currently I'm serving in Home Fellowship Movement. And then a bit about my education as well. I was born and brought up in Manipur, but then I came here from my college for bachelor's, and then I was here for 3 years. And then I moved to Coimbatore in Tamil Nadu for my master's. And then after that, I wanted to pursue biblical studies, so I took up Master in Biblical Studies in Manila for 2 years again, and I graduated last June, and I'm here.
Wow, that's quite a CV that you have. And so we are quite happy to have you here, Yaya. So just to start today's topic and discussion on it, maybe I'll just start asking you this very fundamental question. What do you think is obedience?
I think when we think of obedience, as someone who is born and brought up in a Christian family and who grew up going to Sunday school,
Yes.
when we think of obedience, the verse that came to mind right away is Ephesians 6:1. We say, "Children, obey your parents, for this is the right thing to do." So I think when we say obedience I think it's an act of submitting to your parents, your authorities, and acknowledging who they are, and then just abiding to the responsibilities that comes with it. And yeah, I think obedience is, like, in simple terms, it's doing what you're supposed to do, what the right thing to do. Yeah.
That's quite a good definition, I should say, submitting to authorities. And I think all of us, right from our young age, starting right from our homes to our schools, we have been taught that we have to obey. Like Yaya had pointed out, obey your elders, obey your parents. And when it comes to school, obey your teachers, obey your principal, in fact, the higher authorities. So rightly put, Yaya, that it is submission to authorities and doing the right thing. Now, having said that, talked about obedience, who do we actually obey?
I think first is God, because He's the ultimate creator, the ultimate leader in our lives, the ultimate authority. So I think only after God comes our earthly leaders. So the first would be obeying God, doing what we are commanded to do. And then the second would be the leaders that we have on earth, starting from families to the workplaces, schools, all the authorities that comes from there. Yeah.
That's, I think, the perfect hierarchy, I should say. God, then your earthly authorities, starting from your family. When we say family, parents, grandparents, your relatives, all the elders in a family, then you have your school authorities or your workplace authorities and the government, right? Now, the next thing that I just wanted to ask is, why do we need to obey? Say the various hierarchy that you have pointed out, God, the earthly authorities, why?
Why? Because I think obedience is something that we are asked command to do by God, right? And then I think He purposely made us to obey our authorities and Him so that there will be order in our lives. So I think it's not something that is negotiable, but it comes as something according to your purpose here on earth, like what you're called to do or called to be, and your relationship with God. So I think it's something that is commanded to do. So we have to, whether God or it's our earthly leaders. Yeah.
I think that's beautifully put together again, Yaya. So we have to obey because God had ordained us to obey, actually. It's one of His commandments, His command. And I think, as you have rightly pointed out, if we don't obey, there is definitely going to be chaos. I think that's one of the reasons why in schools we have rules and regulations, or even in workplace, we have certain do's and don'ts, and we are to obey them, because if we don't, then there is going to be ultimately chaos. And a world of chaos, we know it's not something that we would like to live in, right? But unfortunately, yes, that is where the world is headed right now. But having said that, now coming to the next thing that I thought we could talk about is, for us as Christians, we are talking about obedience, and you have brought in the picture of God being at the very center of it. So, if I may say, and if you agree, maybe the right term to define it would be godly obedience, right?
Right.
Because, as you said, God has commanded us, He has ordained us to obey. So, godly obedience. So, in a world that we are living in, okay, given the circumstances, we are hearing quite a lot of events happening around us. And also, given the fact that sometimes we are placed in situations and circumstances where we are forced or compelled to obey the authorities, sometimes it may not completely be right. So how do we actually embody this godly obedience in a situation like that? For example, obeying our government, even when sometimes the things that they are imposing upon us to obey is not really right, and we are not happy about it. How do we embody, how do we show this godly obedience in that?
I think first would be like making sure that our focus or our motive of obedience is not for to please the people whom we are serving or ourselves, but as an act of worship to God, our obedience. So whether it be, even in the scripture, it's written that when serve your earthly masters as if you're serving God, right? So whatever we do, wherever workplaces or areas of life that we are called to be, I think our perspective, our motivation to obey, whether it may seem right to us or not, or whether we may agree to the leadership that's happening or to the governing that's happening or not, I think one way of showing godly obedience is seeing as how I can honor God in what, or obey God in the situation where God has put me in. So it's more of like not doing your responsibility out of because you are, I don't know, because you're compelled to, or but it's more of like, okay, since this is where God calls me to be, then how can I honor God in this field? So I think the first would be our motivation, like instead of trying to please people, it's pleasing God. How can I please God? So I think, I don't know if it makes sense.
I think I'm getting what you are trying to say. So maybe let me put it this way so that our viewers also may think upon it. Understanding that God is at the center of these authorities, right? Like, from what you told me, this is what I pick on, that God is at the center of these authorities. So when we are placed in situations or circumstances like that, even when we don't feel like it, we have to remember that it's all about putting God at the center, and it's all about pleasing Him. And I think just to add to that, God has definitely placed these various authorities. It's by His will that they have been placed. So whether we like it or not, we have to obey, right? I think there are various instances in Bible as well where we could see that there were many times when the governments or the governors or the various authorities had imposed rules and regulations, but we often see that the people had to obey, even the prophets or even the godly people or all the believers, they actually obeyed and abide by it. So having said that, now this is about godly obedience, and we have understood what obedience is. Now, we know that on one end of the spectrum is godly obedience, like you said, putting God at the center, pleasing Him. At the other end of the spectrum is obviously disobedience. So what do you think this disobedience means, and what do you think are its implications?
I think disobedience is refusal to submit to your authorities or rebellious. So I think it's unwillingness to acknowledge your authorities and your refusal to submit to their leadership. I think that would be disobedience. So be it at home or workplace. And I think when we disobey God, then of course we sin, right?
Yes,
When we
yes.
fail to obey God, then we sin. And then I think um, when we disobey both God and our earthly leaders, there is disorder, and we face the consequences accordingly. And again, like for us Christians, when we sin, the consequence of sin is death, right? But of course, like through Christ, then we can have the salvation and all that.
Yes.
But yeah, I think when we disobey, then there is disorder. Yeah, in everything that's happening. So you're not able to glorify God to where God has placed you to be. You cannot fulfill the
Exactly,
purpose where
exactly.
God has allowed you um, to be or to do, right? Through your work or through your positions of that. And yeah, you cannot really live to the fullest. You cannot really, I don't know, like understand and see what's the purpose of God placing you there. So when you disobey God, you cannot really fully grasp the purpose of God, and you cannot honor God. Yeah.
So rightly said again. So starting from again what I picked up on, you talked about the earthly disobedience first. So obviously disobeying the higher authorities results in chaos. Again, simple example: schools, colleges, workplace. We don't follow, then there is going to be chaos, and I think that distorts the very equilibrium of the whole system, right? And having said or talked about godly disobedience, okay, when we are disobeying God, you have very rightly put, we are sinning. And I think we are becoming a hindrance, a stumbling block to the calling that He has given us, right? And that sort of distances us. So you have put it very nicely. So I hope even the viewers and the listeners have quite got on that. And so the takeaway for us would be, as Christians, as believers, why not embody the lifestyle of
Right.
godly obedience, right? Remembering that, to sum it all up, remembering that it is an act of worship, and the authorities, the earthly authorities that have been placed in our life, that have been placed in accordance to God's will. So we have to obey them regard. And if we don't obey, there is disorder, chaos. And most importantly for us as Christians, disobeying God means distancing ourselves from Him. That means being a sin, and in the process, we are actually withholding ourselves, right, from the calling, from the purpose. Any last thoughts you have, Yaya, to just add it?
I think when we talk about obedience also, like for example, we touch a bit on like whether it's not that sometimes we do not feel like obeying our earthly leaders, right?
Yes,
Like we
yes.
see that sometimes they are not, like when we see them not leading us in the right way,
Yes,
then I
yes.
think that's when we are we struggle, like
We
whether we
struggle,
should
yes, we
obey or
struggle,
not.
yeah.
Yeah, but I think it's when we talk about obedience, there should also be trust
Yes.
trust as in not only in the leaders, but trusting that God is the one who is
Yes.
sovereign over all. So even if we like it or not, I think in the process we trust that this is that God is still with us, and
Yes.
that God, it's happening under the sovereignty of God. Yeah.
That's beautifully put together in Yaya. And I think it serves as a motivation for both of us and everyone who is listening and viewing this podcast, that even if we don't feel like it, even when we feel that sometimes our earthly authorities are not taking us in the right direction but the wrong direction, we have to remember that God's sovereignty is what is reinstating or putting them in places of authority, and we have to obey them. So that's all I think for today. So thank you so much, Yaya. That was quite an interesting conversation, and I think we have touched quite a bit on godly obedience and obedience in general. So to our viewers and listeners, in case if you have quite a number of questions or maybe some reflections on your part that you want to add to today's conversation, feel free to reach out to us on our Spotify link, YouTube link, and also our Instagram page as well. We would love to hear from you, and maybe you can suggest us as well what are the other interesting topics you want us to discuss about. So thank you so much, Yaya, once again for joining
Thanks
us.
for
It
having
was
me. Yeah.
such a joy.
Same.
Such a joy.
Such an honor.
Yes, and we wish you all the best as well well and our prayers for your ministry and your future.
Thank you.
And to our viewers and listeners, take care of yourself. And until the next podcast, we will see you then. Bye-bye.